Welcome to Restore the Glory podcast. My name is Jake Kim.
And I'm Bob Schutz.
We're two Catholic therapists sharing what we've learned personally and professionally to help you on the journey of restoration. If you've been blessed by our podcast, please prayerfully consider partnering with us on Patreon. Your support will help cover the cost to produce the podcast, but will also give you access to exclusive content like monthly reflections and special live stream teachings. Go to patreon.com/restoretheglory and join the mission of experiencing the restoration of our God-given glory. Hey, Bob, it's good to be with you again. We are here again recording. We just finished up a series on how to build unity in marriage, and that was really good. And for folks who are just joining us now, you might want to go check out that series where we talk all about building marital unity. And the larger context here, listeners, is that we're diving into and really breaking down Bob's book, Be Devoted. So that's a resource we really want to encourage you to get, and you can get that all places that you find books, or you can go to the JP2 website. We'll have all that in the show notes. But Bob, today we're shifting away from the building unity into now talking about healing of the struggles and healing of the difficulties. And, you know, it's funny, I think this is the topic that everybody is curious about. How do I work through and how do I deal with, and maybe some people, how do I make sense of this and all of that? So any initial thoughts right off the bat?
No, just a very real struggle for many of us. I know marriage was probably the most challenging and the most rewarding, but the most challenging relationship in my life because it's the most intimate and it's every part of you. It just brings every part of you and in a certain way exposes every part of you in a way that no other relationship does. And so we can't run in marriage. We can run, but it doesn't help the marriage much.
Isn't that true? And maybe even a step further, it doesn't really help you a whole lot to just run as an initial reaction. I mean, marriage is so complex and each situation is unique, but I think what we've learned from the culture and what I think people do is that they go, this isn't fun. I'm out, you know? Yeah. And I know that one of the first things that I found in my marriage is gonna change you. Like, if you're not ready for the real deal, if you're not ready, then you're in the wrong area. You know, I'm trying to think of what I mean by ready. And I think it's just like, you better be, well, I think the phrase that's accurate is, if you're not ready to be a saint and be made into one, you're in the wrong area. You know, I think that's maybe an initial thing people confuse is, what's the intention that God had with the sacrament? I think a little bit of sacramental theology is sacraments are meant to make us holy.
Yes, and to image Christ.
Yeah. Right. And without that, I mean, if you take that out of what marriage is, then it just seems like, what in the world is going on here? You know, your fists are to the heavens going, what have you done? Why have you given me this person? And he's like, it was on purpose, you know, like I had real intention behind it, you know? But one thing we had talked about before we turned on the mics was setting up a little bit about some of the backdrop to marital tension. And then we're really over the next 3, we think, episodes, we're not sure exactly what it'll be, but going into how to heal those tensions and problems. But I'll introduce the idea, and it's when you look kind of at the order of creation, and when the pinnacle of creation occurs, and that's with man and woman, that whole dynamic of male, female, and they're called to become one is the closest image of God that we see, other than Jesus coming in later on in the story. But I think something that's there we've got to acknowledge is that when the fall happened, the enemy just doesn't like God. I mean, I'm really understating that. And so the things that really image God, he assaults like vehemently. He hates it, so he goes after it. And without that backdrop, you know, so many times you can just point the finger right at your spouse and not realize there's other things at play here. There's other aggravants, or if that's even a word, but yeah. Thoughts?
Yeah, definitely thoughts on this. I think we shared it in the talking about spiritual unity, but when I was working with somebody coming out of Satanist, they talked about the active warfare against priests and against marriages, because those are the two places where God's image is most to be represented in the church and in marriage. And it's the place where Satan hates most. And so I think of the scripture, and this may be a good lead scripture for us today, which is our battle's not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. And that's always a checkpoint in marriage for me. When I would start to get into judging Margie or feeling like, why are we doing this? And, what's going on here? Realizing she's not my enemy. The enemy is our enemy, our common enemy.
Amen.
And that we're on the same team. And that we need to be able to fight for each other and for our marriage, because that's the battle that Christ is fighting, and not participate in the battle of the enemy, which is trying to separate and divide. Sin is separation, division. Satan is the opposer. Demons are dividers, And so if we can recognize that from the very beginning, that if we have a marriage that's desiring holiness, there's always going to be opposition to it. And some of those are very natural. Some of those are supernatural.
Yeah. I feel like for a lot of us, we forget that category of reality. And, I'm trying to think here of an analogy, and the only thing that comes to mind is when COVID hit, one of the things that was a weird blessing was all the smog in these huge cities lifted, and it was like they saw the blue sky for the first time in their life. But they were just so used to walking around and breathing in this polluted environment, right? And I'm going, that's a reality that for them is the air they breathe. It's there all the time. And I'm thinking that's a decent analogy of what it's like in the spiritual realm. You wake up every morning and all the things that go on. If you forget some of the basics that maybe you can't see, then all of a sudden you start blaming things that aren't totally responsible, or realize that you can make real progress sometimes in a marriage relationship simply by acknowledging the warfare that's involved and addressing that. A simple resource that I would give to people is Father Chad Rippiger, I think I'm saying that right, has a exorcism prayers for laity. Again, I'll put it in the show notes. And what's funny, Bob, is that you can get a decent sense of how Heather and I are doing is if that book's on her nightstand. I always kind of chuckle, like, oh boy, what's going on that I don't see or know because the book's out,
Yeah.
But they actually even have an app that my spiritual director encouraged me to dive into, and it's just acknowledging that reality that's there. So we're not really wanting to spend the episode or the series on that, but I think it's a critical category for people to be aware of, and don't underestimate the influence of the enemy. If you're wondering, how do I know that it's him? Discernment of spirits. That's what that's all about.
Yeah. If I could add one little anecdote, as you're talking
Please.
about the smog and there are spiritual environments like our homes that can embody spiritual stuff. I think I've shared the story about moving into a house with a couple who divorced, and I didn't get the house blessed. But also I think of couples who had their conversion experience going to Medjugorje, and what they talked about is the warfare that was just there. And then when they walked into the environment in Medjugorje, there was like this sealed area. It's like somebody even had a vision of these angels over the heavens blocking out the demonic. And so there was just a protected area. And they said it just changed all the dynamics between them. There was just this way of knowing God and knowing each other that they hadn't realized they were missing. And it's like that fog lifting.
You and I know this. It's just a category that we try to be aware of. We don't do it perfectly. But if for somebody's going, well, how do you know? I think one of the first things to realize is that the enemy's a liar, and his minions and his whole thing's a liar. So what's the typical way that comes? A suggestion in your mind. Yeah. So very simply stated, something like, he is such an idiot. I can't stand him.
Yeah.
She is so ridiculous. If she would just... Those are very possibly a suggestion from the enemy that it has the tone that it's your own thought and your own, but be very careful of that stuff, because that's the primary way, and that does happen. The enemy can suggest something in your mind. Some people go, but what? How's that work? I thought he
Yeah.
was like a pitchfork flying around
Yeah.
bat looking guy. No, he's a spirit, and so spirits work in the knowledge or in the knowing, and so that's their primary means of communication.
I would say every area where there's not love, the enemy's working.
Whew. That ups the ante.
Yeah.
Yeah.
God is love, and the enemy is the opposer of love.
Right. And yeah, look where the enemy started the assault.
Yeah.
He looked up at God, we could say, and went, not winning that one.
Yeah.
Look at what just happened to me. Then he looks at creation and looks at those two and goes, that's too much goodness. I'm after it. I'm taking those suckers out. Look how weak they are. Look how whatever, you know. So just a really important category to keep in mind, and we'll try to keep that in mind for our listeners as we move along here. But our first kind of area that we want to talk about, we're really basically going through the final three chapters and Be Devoted. So again, if you're following along, we're really doing a deep dive here in Bob's book, Be Devoted. So the first of those last three chapters is titled Understanding the Roots of Conflict. So Bob, you say something in the book there that I know when I read it, I just went, come on. You know, it was one of those kind of things. And it took me back because I think it had so many assumptions about what conflict was like and how you work through it. But here's what you say, and you're drawing the idea from John Gottman, who's one of the grandfathers of marriage therapy. Great guy, great book, great stuff that he puts out. So in the book, you say, most conflicts in marriage are not resolvable. It's how we relate to each other during conflicts that matters most. And I have to say, Bob, when I read it, I just went, what? What the heck am I fighting for then? Like, you know, and it just exposed this, well, I'm trying to be right, you know, like I'm trying to prove my point or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And boy, I see that in therapy as well.
Yeah. Again, it's drawing on John Gottman's research over lots of years of studying couples over time and seeing that they came back with the same conflicts. And I think we can all relate to that, you know, there are some conflicts that we have, we don't, you know, if we can just resolve this, we're going to really be happy. And, yeah. But the key in there is honor. And most of us lose the capacity to honor the other when we get into a heated situation, when we get into something that really matters to us and we begin to disagree about it and disagreement turns into fight, whether the fight is outward or inward, you know. But when we begin to go there is when the gloves come off and we begin to become nasty. We'll talk about this the next talk when we talk about the areas of that. But that loss of honor, that loss of respect, you know, the places where we begin to, as you were talking about, the judgments that we start to make in our hearts, the ways we speak to each other, the ways that we kind of reinforce the other's shame.
Right.
You know, you'll never be this, and it can be just in a look, you know, just in the way that we look, a look of contempt or disdain.
Right.
And that's what destroys a marriage.
Yeah, there's so much that's going on in my mind, and I think I'll just keep the ball rolling because I'm thinking not resolvable could feel like defeat, you know, like, because I think sometimes that we stake our claim in some ways, and we're, Bob, I think what's going on is I'm like, can we get to the next talk? Can we get to the next talk? Because that's the one where we get into wounds, right? And that's I often in my work with people live in that space. Yeah. So this kind of stuff, and that's why I love how when you as a teacher, is you patiently go through the whole thing, and I'm the impatient guy in the back going, yeah, come on, get to the good stuff, as if this isn't the good stuff, right? I skip over this, and anyway. But okay, so one of the things you just said that it jarred my memory is you said honor. And the first thing that popped into my head was, I will love you and honor you all the days of my life. And and the, you know, fireworks went off in my head, and I thought, you know, the vows are not just some random words thrown together by some old dudes in Rome. That is not what they are, but that's often what we can treat them as. And I will love you and honor you all the days of my life. That's like the core essence of when the sacrament is taken place, you know, those words that are spoken to each other, the words spoken over your spouse. And so I think like you're saying, those are the great criteria. That's the great spot to pause and go, am I doing this in love? Am I doing this in honor? Because one, that's what I promised, but two, that's where the grace flows.
Yes.
In the sacrament is through and those. So of course you'd say honor, because that's what the whole thing's, that's what we agreed to. That's what the grace flows through. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's so difficult. And I heard another author that I've liked over the years, John Sanford. He wrote a book with his son, and he made a statement that was just really mind-blowing to me because it really was very sobering. He said, our life will, and he's quoting Ephesians 6. He says, our life will go well to the extent to which we've honored our parents. And then he says, you will notice that the way that you've honored your parents is the way that you honor your spouse. I was like, oh, wow.
Whoa.
Wow. And
no kidding.
There was a period after my parents' divorce and where I formed judgments towards my mother and judgments towards my father. And my dad wasn't around, so they were just held inside.
Right.
But my mom was around, and so she would get the brunt of it. And I look at that and I say, oh, man, what seeds I was planting in my heart.
Wow.
Or the enemy was planting in my heart.
Right.
During that time that popped up in different ways in my marriage.
Man, no kidding. I mean, gosh, that's sure. I can see that in my own marriage where, wow, there's a lot there, I feel like. So I guess just listeners, just as a reminder, when you're listening to the podcast, because I'm saying this to myself, so I thought might as well say this out loud. Bob and I can't hit pause and just sit with the idea as much as maybe we would like to, but you can as a listener. So I just want to give you permission that if something strikes you, just click pause. If you're in your car, click pause and just ponder that for a second. Let that sink in. Pray about it. Lord, what more do you want to show me here? I think we listen to podcasts with such a just zip and I'm done. Next one, whoop, okay. But Bob and I sincerely pray that the Spirit would move and that God would heal you. That's what we're after. That's what we're hoping for. So, take the permission that if something strikes you, like I think this would be a spot where I'd probably pause, because I'm really struck by the honoring of my parents versus the honoring of Heather and the dishonor as well. And I can see the parallels very quickly, and I've never thought about it like that before. So I would be pausing right now and going, okay, come Holy Spirit, come into this, speak more into this. Please heal me, right? The first ideas that come to my mind are, I need to repent of this, right? And I'm drawing people try to into my heart so they can see the system that I go through to try to give them an idea about.
That's great. That's great.
So then I'd literally get out my phone and I have a note in my phone that's my examination of conscience. And it'd be one of those times where I'd go, okay, I need to put this in my phone for my next confession. I'm going to repent of all of the ways that I've dishonored my parents again, the new ones that I've thought of, and dishonored Heather. And then the next step is to deeply consider me actually saying and bringing that up with my actual parents and with Heather. And what's funny is that the confession thing for me is fairly easy. I've worn that sacrament out, I use that buddy a lot. But when it comes to, that's a little bit more touchy to actually go over and say something to the real person, the humility meter is all of a sudden. Yeah. It's a different level. Different. Yeah. Yeah. And we're going to get there. We even talk about it later on in this series. We're going to talk about how to actually do a bit of that and some of those key categories. So listeners, stay tuned. Okay. We're talking here again, most conflicts in marriage are not resolvable. It's how we relate to each other during the conflicts that matters most. Bob, you kind of break down in the book a little bit more and you go further a little bit here with some of the common differences that are in marriages. And I think this is what you were getting at about not resolvable. For example, lifestyle, personality, gender, values. Those are some of the ones that you list in the book. And what was funny is that when you said lifestyle, I went, lifestyle? What do you mean lifestyle? And then the idea popped into my head is that, and I don't know if this is a man thing, and I feel like maybe the women who are listening are going to go, oh my gosh, it's not just Jim or my husband or whatever, is that men are usually much louder on the day-to-day than women. And I regularly get the feedback from Heather like, oh my gosh, you're so loud. and
Yeah.
I'm not even aware of it. And it's not like I'm yelling or anything. It's how I take a plate out of the cupboard, or I get a pot to make something, or I'll just like make a noise because it's like I need to get off some tension or whatever, and I make a loud noise, or I snuggle the dog and everything, the volume's up, I guess, and I don't even notice it, right? And Heather's like, my word. And Maria, my oldest, she would, I caught them a couple of times looking at each other. They would look at each other and just kind of shake their head, and like, Dad's in the room, and they're like, what are you guys talking about? And they go, Dad, when you go away for a trip or something, the whole volume level in the house goes down. And then they said, if Judah's away as well, my son,
Yeah.
it's like we're in a monastery in here. You know? I just go, oh, I didn't. And so I don't know if that's generic, but that's an example of,
Yeah.
that's just how I walk through the day. You know, I'm not tenderly getting out a fork. I'm like, where's the stinking fork? And I just
Yeah.
rip it out of there.
Yeah. And some of that's gender difference, and some of that's temperament differences, right? And different temperaments in marriage, those are going to stay with you the entirety of your marriage.
Yeah.
And it's not a matter of, I'm going to change you to be like my temperament, or you're going to change me to be like your temperament.
Mm-hmm.
Somehow we're going to have to learn to not only live with each other, but honor each other in our temperaments. Yeah. And there can be a blending. We can grow. We can learn from each other and balance our temperaments with the other's temperament, but our temperament's going to be the same. You know, it starts at birth, and we just see it. I see it in my grandkids and my children. And we all, you know, Margie and I had very different temperaments. And, you know, just one example, she loved being around people in the parties.
Yeah.
And I didn't like them at all.
Yeah.
I like people, but I like them one-on-one.
Right.
I don't, you know, I like speaking to whole groups, but I don't like being in a party where I have all these needs around me and all these people I want to have one-on-one interaction with, and it just overwhelms me. But Margie just becomes the life of the party in it, you know? And so just that temperament, and that created a lot of tension between us.
I can imagine.
A lot of tension.
Yeah. I know that exact one. And I think there's the point is that's a really good example of something that can become the source of so much conflict. And this is to your point. That's not worth even trying to resolve, because it goes back to temperament or personality or gender. And then again, I think one of the things, just as a caveat, these are the things that God designed you in a particular way. And it is so easy to lose sight that God had an intention with how he made Jake, Bob, Heather, Margie, and on and on and on and on. He intentionally made us in such a way. And if we're arguing with each other about that stuff's unresolvable, and it's actually God infused, you know? That's just a losing battle right there.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. If we go back to our last series, when we were talking about teamwork and mutual submission, there needs to be ways of working together in those differences and becoming a team. So it's not just, I'm an individual, you're an individual, we're going to go our own ways. We got to work that way. So in that way, we need good conflict resolution skills. But that conflict can't be to try to change the other person to be what I want them to be. That's the unresolvable conflict.
Right.
And even so many of the ways we do things, you know, like, is the toilet paper go up or down? Right. You know, do we eat at 6 o'clock or 8 o'clock? You know, whatever those things are, we've got to find ways of meeting in the middle, but we can't change each other.
Yeah. Well, clearly it's at 6, Bob. I don't know if you knew that.
It's 6 for me too. But my brothers and sisters, it's 8. So
there we go. There's a good example. Yeah. And I think, you know, I mean, it's funny that we're teasing and joking around with that, but those things can become real things. I mean, it's the classic, right? How do you fold the towels? How do you put on the toilet paper roll, all that kind of stuff. But those things can create real tension, you know, real dynamics. And that's the stuff that if you're trying to change your husband or wife's personality, lifestyle, gender, values, that's going to be really, really hard. All right. So Bob, maybe I'll take it a step deeper into a really sensitive one that I've seen in the professional world. And that is a mixed faith. You know, the husband, let's say, is Catholic and the wife is Protestant, or the wife is a devout Catholic and the husband doesn't go to church, but he's still a very virtuous man. Those sometimes create intense conflict. So maybe we can zoom in on that for a little bit, because people might go, but we're supposed to evangelize. We're supposed to try to convert. We're supposed to, right? But is that something that changes or doesn't change? Like, what are your initial thoughts?
Well, I immediately go to Margie and I. When I had my deeper conversion, Margie didn't go with me, and it created a tremendous division between us. And, to the point where it was one of the things that got us to the point of a breaking point in our marriage. And so it's the very thing which is supposed to keep us together became a source of division, which again is the enemy working in our weaknesses. But at first I tried to get her to come along, right, and realize that she was disrespected and that her own individual freedom, her own individual autonomy. So it'd be like, come to Mass with me, right? And it would tie into her growing up Catholic guilt, and it would just create a resistance that was bigger than between us. It was tapping into something, right? But eventually, and it was very painful because it was the deepest area I wanted to share together. But eventually, it was being able to be quiet, even though I felt that way. I wanted her to be there. I just turned it into prayer. Then eventually, it was just trying to hear her heart and hear what was going on with it, and recognize that God and her had their own things. And, after I began to respect her much more, not ever perfectly, but much more in that area, she would do things like when we went on vacation, she'd pray the rosary with me, or go to Mass with me away from the crowd. One of the things that I found out is that she didn't like everybody that I'd been seeing in therapy coming up to me after Mass, and she didn't want to be around it and felt awkward. Stuff that I didn't even anticipate.
Exactly what you mean.
Stuff that I didn't even anticipate. Right. That were part of the issue of why she wasn't going. So it was really listening to her and hearing her heart and respecting her freedom. And as I share in Be Devoted, that was an area that came together at the end of our marriage that was just a God thing. And he worked out the deepest desire of my heart and turned out to be her heart too.
Amen. I mean, Bob, I really appreciate what you said there, which I think at the same time is very hard to do. And that's respecting the freedom of the other person and respecting the journey that they and God are on. That is not easy to do. And I think a lot of times we pride ourselves, and falsely and wrongfully pride ourselves in how we're going to convert our spouse and how we're going to do that. And it's almost this self-serving behavior, or we've forgotten that they're our spouse. They're now a project, or they're now something that's going to prove our capacity and worth, and just all that twisted stuff. And I think the thing that we fail to realize is, like, they can't feel and see that stuff.
Right. Yeah. It's the very thing that we're trying to do, which is to solidify our sacrament. We're violating our sacrament in the very act of it by not loving them well and not honoring them well, as you were talking about before.
Yeah. It's such, I think, a twist for a lot of people. It's like, what? How? And I think the key there, which is the teaching of the church, is that you have to honor the individual's freedom. Yes. And we see that riddled throughout the Gospels. Jesus does put the difficult dynamic or the invitation there, but you don't ever see him grabbing them by the wrist and pulling them into the synagogue or whatever he might have done, right? He doesn't, that is not how he operates. And you don't see him shaming people when they, like the rich young man, he shares his sorrow. And Jesus respects his decision as he walks away. And he acknowledges the idea. And I think as spouses, Jesus might have said in that scenario, it's harder for a camel to enter through the eye of a needle. And I think we as spouses yell that as they're walking away, like, yeah, it's harder for a camel, you camel, and then the whole thing breaks down at that point. And gosh, that's just a big one for me in this category, is honoring the freedom that they have in honoring the journey that they're on with God. And I don't in any way try to allude to the fact that, oh, now it's all easy.
Not at all.
No, like for you and Margie, it didn't, that reality wasn't easy as you honored her freedom.
I prayed every morning for that unity, every morning for 30 years, probably.
Wow.
And that gave me peace. That gave me freedom. And I saw little fruits along the way, but it wasn't like things changed quickly in that area. And yet Margie had such a great heart and she was loving people. And so it was like, you know, I was being more the hypocrite than her.
Wow. That's a big thing to admit.
Because I was wanting something early on, particularly wanting something spiritually between us, but not living it with her in the way that she needed for me to love her early on.
Right. I mean, it's so, like, how would Jesus approach the situation?
Yeah.
Is the golden question. And the answer, just look at the Gospels.
Yeah.
And we see what he does with laying down his life, and yet how he handles the invitations and the rejections of those invitations. You know, we just finished it a couple series ago with Peter. Like, look at that one. That's a crazy one about how he handled the rejection and he honored him. He returned and honored and honored. And there's the saint-making quality of marriage right there. When you're not getting what you want or the other person's not doing what you want, but you continually show up to love and bless and honor. Like, whew, that's not for the faint of heart.
No, that's not.
Yeah. So, Bob, one of the things that you mentioned in the book, which I really appreciated, just to zoom in on a specific here, was with regard to you're quoting a fellow therapist, Catholic therapist in our world, Gregory Popchak, who has various resources and books. He's actually, I think we've referenced his group on our website for resources for people who are seeking therapy. He comments about the don't fall into stereotypes when it comes to gender differences or other kind of differences because, oh, that's a guy thing. Oh, that's a girl thing. He says that in his experience, I'm not sure where he draws the statistic from, but you draw from him and say that 20% of the time, those gender differences are actually reversed. And where I think the stereotype might be where the guy is the high communicator, high sensitivity, and the woman is high drivenness, high assertiveness. Maybe some of those typical, the guys, maybe stereotypically, he's the one that likes to cook. He's the one that likes to, I don't know, whatever, all those stereotypes that get blown apart. I appreciated that. Don't get locked into the stereotype, because I've noticed that in my life and in my marriage, there's certain stereotypes that are not accurate for Heather and I. Did you find that with Margie too?
Yeah, in several different areas. Like I was the one who wanted to communicate more.
Good example.
Than she did.
Right.
But there were some ways that I was very much like most men, and there are some ways in which we were opposite.
Right.
Another example of that is we would typically see the man want to come home after work and grab a beer and sit out and be quiet. And I talk about it in the book, but that was Margie. She wanted to do that. I didn't want to do that. That wasn't my desire. So there are some ways in which we were opposite.
Right.
Than the stereotypes.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And it's just something to be very mindful of, that if you don't fit all the stereotypes, that's fine. And, you don't again, try to go, oh my gosh. And you like to talk more, like that's just a fast way to kill a relationship. So Bob, one of the final points I want to get to for today's episode, and it's a phrase that I know you highlight in the book, and you and I've talked about outside of the podcast, that is really meaningful to you. And that's about when the content of the conversation shifts and now the relationship's issue. But here's the quote that you say: if an argument lasts beyond 15 minutes, you can be assured that the content is no longer the issue. The relationship has become the issue.
Yeah.
Break that open.
Yeah. I went to graduate school 40 years ago. Marriage and family, and that's I think
stated yourself.
I think that's the only quote that I remember verbatim, and I may not remember it verbatim, but that's what I remember verbatim.
Interesting. Yeah.
I remember a lot of other things from graduate school, but that one I remembered very specifically because it really stood out to me, and explained a lot to me.
Right.
And basically it's saying the issues can be resolved if we don't bring in our personal reactivity into it.
Yeah.
We can talk through things. So that's one of the things that makes conflicts unresolvable, is all the stuff that we bring to it and all the areas. So if we're discussing something like how are we going to discipline the kids,
Right.
we should be able to, in 15 minutes may be exaggeration, but we should be able to work through that and come to a shared agreement,
Yeah.
And yet it's all of my perceptions and all of my fears and all of my judgments and all of your fears and all of your judgments and all of the ways we treated each other about this issue, all the ways we were brought up. I mean, all that comes into the discussion.
Right.
And so we move from calmly discussing our differences and coming to God's heart in the situation to all of this other stuff starts to interfere. And we'll talk about this the next time, but it's some of it's the wounds we carry. Some of it's the judgments we carry. Some of it's the way we treat each other out of that.
Right. I'm sure, Bob, that you have people, I know I have people in my life where all that other stuff, the what I call the stuff below the water line of our heart, all the stuff underneath the surface, where it doesn't maybe get highly activated. And when you have a discussion with them about a pragmatic thing, I know that experience to be true, where you can get right through something quite quickly. Take for example, you and I talking about episodes and things.
Yeah.
We're very similar. And so when we go, yeah, oh, good idea.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, nice. I like that. Sure. Let's do it. Done. Right.
Right.
And that's a good example where there's not a lot of stuff being stirred up. But man, if Heather and I were having to decide an idea about an episode, it would take us, and I think that's a good example because there's so much that gets activated underneath the surface. And so that quote is just brilliant because it's not, I think people might hear it and go, oh, I've got to have all my conversations done in 15 minutes.
Yeah,
no, that's not what you meant. It's not a literal thing. It's a figurative thing to help shine a light on something deeper. If you're just going round and round and round and round about how to discipline the kids, or do we go to mass, Saturday night, or do we go Sunday, or do we spend Thanksgiving at your parents or if those things don't have a relative smooth to them, a relative ease, a bit of, yeah, here's my thought. Oh, good. Yeah. Okay. Here's my thought. Oh, I didn't think about that. I don't agree with you, but okay.
Yeah.
If that doesn't occur, there's other stuff coming into the mix, and be careful,
And it's often.
Yeah. There you go. The understatement of the year. Yeah, it's true. I mean, like when you said judgments earlier, I just thought, man, in the notes I wrote down for our next episode, I just highlighted that. And I thought that one is so stinking powerful.
Yeah.
But I mean, we'll get to that. But I think this is important foundational stuff that we're laying here to be able to know the distinction between what's underneath the waterline in my heart and what isn't. And so, yeah, 15, 20, 30 minutes, maybe even an hour if it's an intense conversation or topic or discussion. And what's interesting for Heather and I, when we've done your marriage conferences, one of our highest unity categories is teamwork. And so we're actually very, very high in that together, because if Heather and I get on a mission together, we work very well together. And so I know the difference and this kind of thing, like when it comes to, planning a retreat, or even let's navigate the kids in this scenario, we're very, very unified in those things. It's interesting. But then it goes all kinds of sideways when I forget to do something. I'm like, it's not that big of a deal. Come on, stop overreacting. And then here we go, all that stuff.
Yeah. I haven't been in your home ever.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you've been in mine. I don't think so.
Not physically.
Yeah. But I know somebody who has been around you and Heather with your kids and talk about what great parents you are together. And that's an example of that. It's like, you've been able to teamwork.
Yeah.
In such a way that you're focused on your kids and your kids' development and being able to work out how to love them well. And,
right.
Just person that shared that with me just said, the great kids, and they really loved them well.
Yeah. And I imagine the person could say, and when the kids aren't involved. Because a lot of Heather and mine's, because of her podcast and mine, a lot of our stuff is open and
Public. Yeah.
public, and we have a lot of mutual friends. But you're right that it's just, again, I think the question that I'm asking myself or thinking about for myself when I'm in those dynamics with Heather or when I'm helping other people is I'm asking, what's going on in your heart? Even more specifically, what are you feeling right now? And what are you thinking right now? And then if you want to get a third one, what are you desiring right now? Thinking, feeling, desiring.
Yeah.
And those are pretty good indicators of where you are. If your emotions are really, really jacked up and really intense, the conversation is going to be difficult. And that's just hands down. I mean, unless you're watching a football game and you both are super fans of a certain team. Yeah, your emotions are high and you're loving it. But
yeah, so let's turn that into a practical as we
let's do it.
Move to the end here.
Let's do it.
So just 3 things that you just described, I would recommend to everybody who's listening to just today sometime, or if you can't today, sometime this week, write down the thoughts that you had about your spouse. Write down the feelings you had about your spouse, and write down the desires that you had. And then take each of those and bring it into prayer. So talk to Jesus about what you think about your spouse, and then listen to what he says about what he thinks about your spouse and about what you think. And then your feelings towards your spouse, and then how he feels towards your spouse, and what his response is to your feelings. And then what are his desires for your marriage? And just enter into dialogue there. I think it could be a beautiful dialogue.
That's a great,
very simple way.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful baptism of that. The little tool I say for people, if you're trying to remember what those 3 things are, is I use T for thoughts, E for emotions, D for desires, and I call it a TED Talk.
Yeah.
So you're having a TED Talk with yourself. But man, I never even think about, like, that's really powerful to have a TED Talk with the Lord about your spouse.
Yeah. I used to journal for years, and it was just me with me, and it got pretty sickening. And I didn't make much progress.
It's so true, huh? Yeah, and you're a very good therapist, right? And that's just the reality of, that's not the way to go about it. That's a really beautiful, I think, practical that we can wrap up on, because all that content or all that stuff that's stirring up is a great segue to where we're going next, because a lot of that stuff is going to be rooted in things and drawing unhealthy life or brokenness from other stuff that's a big part of why marriages struggle and how they need healing and restoration. And the answer there is what happened to us before we ever got married and what life was like, etc. So, Bob, any final thoughts?
Yeah. One other thing with Be Devoted that's there in the show notes, I wrote it as a guide either for couples before marriage or in marriage or therapists, but it's a guide to walk you through these processes. And not that particular exercise, but there are exercises about conflict in each of these chapters that I think can be really helpful. I've seen that fruit in couples who are doing that. So that's another practical.
That's very true. I mean, the book is full. At the end of every chapter, there's practicals.
Yeah.
And they're not like, they're not cheap practicals, I'll say. It's not like, how did you like this chapter?
Yeah.
Right. It's some of them are pages of practicals and literally walking people through processes. So, again, I echo that, Bob. As a recipient of the book, I really echo that there's a lot there for people to find in the book to really help them move forward. And you link to other spots and places where they can take that even further. So, well, listeners, thanks for being with us. We're excited that you're on this journey with us and hoping that this episode blessed you. And as we continue on in this series about the healing and restoration of marriage. So you can find our episodes any places that you find podcasts, but maybe you're thinking of somebody and you want to share this episode with them. You can send them to our social media that will just give them a taste of what we're about. Or ideally, you'd send them to our website, because that's kind of the main hub of where all the stuff is that we're doing. And so that website is restoretheglorypodcast.com. temperament.com. Thanks so much, and God bless you. And we pray that you would continue to experience the abundance of God's love, mercy, and healing.